When asked the question, what is the purpose of art? A number of answers could spring to mind. One might say, to convey an idea or mood through nonverbal form. One might also say, to serve as an outlet of personal expression, or to evoke a certain emotion from the viewer. Or one might simply say, to create something beautiful or aesthetically pleasing. And what one considers aesthetically pleasing can vary as much as the answers I just laid out. One might enjoy the subjectivity of the Impressionists, the abstractions of Matisse and Kandinsky, or the technical mastery of Michelangelo and David. Whatever you enjoy, and whatever your answer to my first question may be, I would hazard a guess as to say that it rests on the belief that art is something to be appreciated in its own right, that it has an intrinsic value. However, this wasn't the case in the Soviet Union, where an art form called Socialist Realism was not just the dominant style, it was the mandatory one. Socialist realism began as a form of literary expression when it was mandated as the official style of the Soviet Union at the Soviet Writers' Congress in 1934, and eventually expanded to the visual arts. Andrei Zhdanov, Joseph Stalin's Minister of Culture and personal delegate at the conference, gave a speech that laid out the principles of socialist realism. Art was to be a vehicle for the Marxist ideology on which the Soviet Union was founded. It had to celebrate the working class, around whom Soviet society was built. The range of subjects an artist could tackle were extremely limited, mostly revolving around state initiatives for industrialization and collectivized agriculture, or around the glorification of the Communist Party or Stalin himself. And it had to be easy art, nothing particularly challenging, nothing that would make you think. Art that made you think was for the bourgeoisie, the upper class, the people who had sophisticated tastes and artistic education. And in a society run by the proletariat, being bourgeois was essentially the equivalent of being the devil. No, socialist realism was simple, straightforward art. It had to be objective and realistic in its depiction. No subjectivity, no abstractions. It was meant to be accessible. It was meant to be for the masses. Anything that wasn't for the masses was bourgeois, and allowing it to survive in the Soviet Union would lead to dangerous, bourgeois attitudes that would undermine the perfect proletarian society. Art, like the economic means of production, was socialized in the Soviet Union. It was an attempt to engineer Soviet culture in order to maintain a culture dominated by the working class. In the words of Zhdanov, art was to, quote, serve the new cause of socialist construction, unquote. And it served this cause in two ways. One, by functioning as socialist propaganda and injecting Marxism into the cultural consciousness, and two, by making sure that the working classes, rather than the upper classes, were the primary lovers of art in the Soviet Union. Art was not treated as intrinsically valuable, but as a means to a socialist end, similar to the way Soviet citizens were themselves treated by the state. Not as individual human beings with inherent worth, but as agents of social progress, as productive workers whose primary purpose was to advance the economic and cultural development of the Soviet Union. Eventually, socialist realism was enshrined in law in the form of the Zhdanov Doctrine, which legitimized the persecution of artists who dared to produce work that lay outside the realm of state-sanctioned artistic expression, who posed a threat to the ideological domination of the party. It sounds like something out of Orwell or Huxley, doesn't it? That's why I get so worried when I hear the whispers of socialist realism echoed in today's cultural discourse regarding art. In the last video in the series, I laid out how the progressive ideology has revived the good and evil dichotomy between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie in the form of racial and gender dynamics, with white people, men, straight people, and cisgendered people essentially being the evil bourgeoisie, and everyone else being the virtuous proletariat. And just like in the Soviet Union, the progressives are attempting to engineer ideological domination through art, even in the most obscure sectors of artistic expression. Now, while some would say otherwise, I would argue that comic books and video games have become an art form themselves. I think that they're not seen that way because the people who are serious about them constitute a pretty niche community, but, of course, progressives have to come in and try to invade the community the same way they did with the atheist and skeptic community. There are tons of leftist ideologues who whine about the lack of diversity in video games, sexism in video games, basically trying to inject identity politics into the production of video games. They judge games based not on the merits of the game, not on graphics or design, not on writing or characters, but on how well the games reflect progressive politics and ideals. If a game doesn't represent minorities well enough, then it's a bad game.
Games have to be concerned with the power imbalance in both narrative and mechanics, particularly when it comes to white player characters facing off against NPCs of color. And that means game designers need to think about everything from the skin color of the enemies on the other end of the barrel to using stereotypes as a crutch for character design.
If it depicts women the wrong way, then it's a bad game.
So the damsel trope typically makes men the subject of narratives while relegating women to the role of object. This is a form of objectification because as objects, damseled women are being acted upon, most often becoming or reduced to a prize to be won, a treasure to be found, or a goal to be achieved.
The same goes with comic books, and really any form of media nowadays, but I'll get more into that later. It's this mindset and this clear desire to push an ideological agenda that leads to movements attempting to enact tangible change in the production and distribution of these art forms, like the Twitter backlash that got this variant Batman cover pulled from the shelves, and the Change.org petition that got Grand Theft Auto V banned from Target in Australia because both of these products allegedly promoted violence against women. These ideologues have no numbers or metrics to show that the existence of these products have any tangible negative effect on the well-being of society, much less that they correlate with an increase in sexual violence against women. They presuppose a problem without first observing it, and thus the only way to solve a problem that hasn't manifested itself yet is to prevent it from happening in the first place. In other words, thought control. The people who signed the petition, and the ones who got the Batman cover pulled, are doing just what Stalin and Zhdanov did. Just as the Soviet Union banned artwork that would lead to dangerous bourgeois thoughts, these progressive ideologues want to ban work that will lead to dangerous, sexist attitudes. Art is judged not based on its inherent value, but on its politics and its ideological content. And in the vein of socialist realism, they inject their own ideological propaganda in place of the artwork that doesn't toe the progressive line. In the realm of comic books, we have Tumblr's body-positive superhero, we have the Canadian Prime Minister and self-described feminist Justin Trudeau as a hero in a Marvel comic, we have the female Thor who beats up sexists, and we have the villain Red Skull making a speech that essentially compares European border control to the Holocaust. And in the realm of video games, there's all kinds of shit that I don't have the patience to go into, so I'll link to a different video in the description. The progressive ideologues who get products pulled from the free market and substitute ideological content in its place have limited both the artist's freedom of expression as well as your freedom to choose which products you want to consume. Such is the nature of authoritarianism. A tiny minority of people dictate what's best for everyone else, and the only kinds of products or ideas you can consume are ones that the minority deems acceptable, whether that minority be the Communist Party of Soviet Russia or the progressive left of the 21st century. These same principles of authoritarianism have sprung up in literature as well. Now, as far as I know, there currently isn't a problem of ideological dogmatism flourishing in the literary world, and as far as books dealing with progressive politics go, I'm sure that there are plenty. There are oceans upon oceans of books out there that none of us will be able to read in our lifetimes, and if reading books that are written with a political agenda in mind isn't your cup of tea, then you have plenty of options to choose from that don't fit that description. However, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the study of literature in universities, because that's really where the hotbeds of political correctness and authoritarian leftism are, where the ideological termites fester and dine on the minds of young students who will one day inherit this planet. God help us all. And it's these students who want to force others to study works with the sole purpose of instilling ideological content in the reader. So let's talk about this article. Yale English students call for end of focus on white male writers. To summarize the article, English majors at Yale are required to read selections from the English literary canon. Shakespeare, Milton, Chaucer, Eliot, the people you're supposed to read to get a foundation of English literature. However, 160 students signed a petition to quote-unquote decolonize the English curriculum, get rid of these white male authors, and substitute them with, quote, literatures relating to gender, race, sexuality, ableism, and ethnicity. The push for reform in the curriculum is based on the idea that all of these required works, because they were written by white male authors, will create a quote-unquote hostile learning environment to students who are not white males. So again, it says nothing about the themes or ideas of the works, these students are judging the value of the works based on the color of the author's skin. And because white men are inherently oppressive, their ideas must be oppressive, because whiteness and maleness are ways of thought or even ideologies in and of themselves. And all white men must think the same, so we can do away with a curriculum that focuses entirely on white male authors. Not even considering the fact that these students want to do away with the study of some of the most fantastic works of literature ever written, there's an obvious irony that the students who wrote and signed the petition haven't even read some of the works in question. Because racism is one of the most important themes of Othello, and there's been extensive feminist scholarship written about the role of women in Hamlet. Seems like that would be right up their alley, doesn't it? But no, anything white or male is inherently bad, and instead of maybe trying to include authors of different backgrounds in the curriculum alongside the white male authors, diversity, they want to abolish the white males entirely, to replace white male domination with domination of a new ideology, like Zhdanov did to any art that was considered bourgeois. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't read works that deal with those other themes, or that we shouldn't read authors from diverse backgrounds. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying. There are tons of fantastic works out there that are written by non-white, non-male authors, and I'm sure that you would have to study at least some of them if you were to graduate with a bachelor's in English, and to be familiar with the totality of English literature. I'm saying that in the wide world of literature out there, we shouldn't try to stifle one part of it to make way for the promotion or domination of another part, especially when that one part is considered to be the very foundation of English literature, and is comprised of works of art that are valuable by their own right, not because of the color of their author's skin. And if you really want to make the argument that an author's race or gender or sexuality must have a significant bearing on the content of their work, and you want to afford white students the benefit of understanding a work from a minority perspective, well, maybe a minority student would also benefit from understanding a work from a white male perspective. Isn't that what these identity politicians are always going on about? How you can't understand a certain group's experience if you belong to a different group? Well, maybe that works two ways. Just a thought. Now, not everyone is a comic book fan or a gamer, and not everyone is a literature buff. But if you try to inject progressive politics into movies and TV, you can bet that a bunch of people are going to see it. And I'd wager that of all the forms of media where progressives try to push their agenda, you're probably most familiar with their constant clamoring in the realm of film and television. I'm sure you've heard them complain about whitewashing, where the studio casts a white actor in a role typically depicted as being a non-white person. I'm sure you've heard them complain about how women and ethnic minorities don't appear in enough films, and how there are too many white heroes who exude quote-unquote toxic masculinity. These are some of the major qualms I hear from the progressive left a lot regarding film, and they're all wrapped up in the buzzword representation. Women and ethnic minorities aren't represented enough, and white male heroes are overrepresented. And what is the progressive left's solution to this imbalance in representation? Well, they've come up with two solutions thus far. One is an affirmative action style quota, like J.J. Abrams' diversity quota in his production company, where women and ethnic minorities will be hired in proportion to their representation in the United States. I'm not even going to start on affirmative action right now and tackle that issue in a separate video altogether, but for the purposes of this video, I'll say that these kinds of policies are just like the push to get white male authors booted from the Yale English curriculum. The policy isn't made based on the content of the white male's work, or what the new diverse representatives will bring to the table. It's simply based on the fact that they're not white. Are you seeing a recurring pattern here? The second solution is the much more obvious of the two, as well as the more impactful one, and the one that carries the more significant implications from an artistic standpoint. Make films and TV shows that star women and ethnic minorities. And again, just like with the literature, this isn't a bad thing. Hell, some of my favorite films and TV shows star women and ethnic minorities, and they're well written too. But just like with any creative project, it can be done well, or it can be done badly. And with this particular issue of representation, it can be done so egregiously that it actually works to the detriment of the project, and reveals the creator as a deliberate panderer. And to illustrate this point, I'm going to have to go into detail about one movie in particular. No, not Ghostbusters. Star Wars. Now, before any of you jump the gun and try to put words in my mouth, I just want to say that I enjoyed the new Star Wars. I thought it was a solid film with a good cast, good effects, and some really cool and fun moments. However, I also thought that there was a clear push to inject identity politics into the movie, and it became increasingly obvious over the duration of the film. Let's take a look at the characters. You have a badass, strong, independent woman as your main character who becomes a Jedi. You have a black man of conscience with an implied bisexual attraction to a Hispanic X-Wing pilot. You have a white guy who's the villain. And you have another white guy who gets killed by the other white guy. Maybe that last part about the white people is stretching it a little. Han and Leia and Luke are all good guys. Rey's white and she's a good guy. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. But I want to zone in on our two main heroes, Finn and Rey, to show how having a diverse cast can be done well, and how it can be done badly. Finn is a good character. Right off the bat, you can tell that he's a good person with a strong sense of justice and a desire to do right in the world. He refuses to kill for the First Order anymore, so he abandons his post under threat of death, and by the end of the movie, he helps destroy the superweapon and becomes the hero he wanted to be. He has a character arc that's set up with a clear motivation, carried out through the entire movie, and resolved at the end. And you see his personality, too. He wants to do well and is a pretty competent combatant, but he's completely lacking in other skills and faces some adversity because of it. You see his moments of confusion and desperation, but also of his optimism and comically misplaced self-confidence. You can see that despite the obstacles in his path, he's trying his best to do what he set out to do, and in the end, he winds up doing some good after all. Oh, and did I mention that he's a black guy? Yeah, that really should be the last thing on anyone's mind. He's not a good character because he's black. He's a good character and happens to be black. That's my problem with Rey. Rey is a terrible character. She has no motivation to do anything in this movie. She's literally just along for the ride. She faces no adversity. She knows how to fix the Millennium Falcon despite probably never having flown on a real spaceship her entire life. She knows how to use a lightsaber and the Force after like a day of finding out she's a Jedi, when most Jedi take years to learn those skills. This isn't nitpicking, this is demonstrating how we can't become invested in a character if they have no odds to overcome. And maybe worst of all, Rey doesn't have a personality. She's a flat, boring Mary Sue who shows no emotion except scared and pissed off. And given the director and the current cultural discourse regarding gender, it's very clear that the only reason she was put in there was because she was a woman, and because for some reason this movie needed a female protagonist. Look, I don't care if the protagonist is a man or a woman. I don't care if it's a white or a non-white person. But they have to be written well. And they can be written well. Check out that show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. It stars a woman who gets thrown into a new environment full of life-or-death situations, feels scared underneath a mask of bravado, has to have other people save her ass a few times, and eventually adapts and comes into her own. And along the way, you learn how she tackles problems. You see that she has a sense of humor, you see her moments of vulnerability, she's a fleshed-out character. And there's also a kick-ass Asian woman with a traumatic past and serious emotional stunting, a black guy who's a spectacular agent but also cares a lot about his family and friends, a Colombian woman and a gay Hispanic-American man who grapple with controlling their superpowers, and 3 non-white villains with fleshed-out backstories that actually humanize them and make them sympathetic characters. They're well-written, well-developed characters with different personalities, goals, and aspirations who happen to be women and ethnic minorities. And the white characters are given just as much attention and development. That's how you have a diverse cast. Or you could go the route of BoJack Horseman. In this last season, there was a lesbian wedding between 2 women of color, and the extras are ethnically diverse as well, and the show just carries on with its own story. Those minority characters are treated as ordinary people. They're not treated as an other. The show doesn't make a big deal about them, and the story happening around them is so good that it doesn't feel like they were shoved in there for the sake of diversity. This is what I want you to take away from this video, especially the sections on literature and film. It's not the race or gender of an artist or character that matters, it's the content of the work. This should be some first grade shit, but apparently the progressives didn't get the memo. And if you're including women and ethnic minorities in your curriculum or in your cast of characters solely for the sake of diversity and not for any artistic value they could contribute, well, that seems like a bigger insult than simply not representing them. You're basically using these individuals as political pawns to push your ideology of diversity and inclusion. You're treating them the same way that the Soviet Union treated its citizens, as vehicles of social progress and ideological construction, as a means to an end. You imply that their only value as artists or actors, as hardworking and creative people, is derived not from their talent, not from their skill, not from any artistic brilliance they might possess, but from their race and gender. And isn't that the worst kind of bigotry of all? Art imitates life, and if we truly live in a diverse and inclusive society, an ideal that I think we should all try to foster, then our art should reflect that. But it's also been said that life imitates art, and I worry that if art continues to be treated as a form of politics or ideological propaganda, then some of that ideology is going to rub off on people. And when that ideology involves dismissing the human and artistic worth of white men, or treating diverse individuals as nothing more than embodiments of their superficial characteristics, well, that's rather disheartening. Art, and the cultural discourse fostered by it, should be free and open, not controlled and engineered. Years before Stalin and Zhdanov started to control art in the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin said, "Art belongs to the people," meaning that art should be the sole province of the working classes, not of the capitalists who were oppressing them. Well, art belongs to everyone. Culture belongs to everyone. Don't let it fall into the hands of the few who would tell you what to think.